Hello, good afternoon, everyone. And I'd like to start by welcoming all of you to Publics at IIHS. As many of you probably know, Publics at IIHS is a platform where we invite researchers, scholars, practitioners of the urban to present and share their work to an online audience. Today we'd like to welcome who's with us, Sam Asher. Sam, as probably many of you know, is Associate Professor of Economics and Public Policy at Imperial College London and the co-founder of the Development Data Lab, which really works to make available underutilized public data to policymakers, civil society, academics, and the private sector in India and beyond. Sam's own research seeks to understand the microeconomic determinants of economic growth, urbanization, and economic opportunity for the poor. And as many of you in the audience would know, together with Paul Novosad and a range of collaborators, they have built a high spatial resolution data platform and new analytic tools to analyze economic development at the local level in India. Today, he is joining us to speak about their recent paper on residential segregation and access to public services in India, where they have assembled a national scale data set on outcomes of residential segregation, access to public services, as well as other economic outcomes across urban and rural neighborhoods. And in particular, they're looking at SCs as well as Muslims in this work. So we're really delighted to have you here with us, Sam, today. And we'll follow the following format for the talk. Sam will begin with a 40-minute presentation, and then we'll be opening it up to questions. So in the audience, if you have a question, I would request you to put it into the Q&A box rather than the chat box, and we will be taking them in groups at the end. So with that, I'll hand over to Sam.
Great. Thank you so much for having me here. Let me just share my screen. Is that showing up okay for everyone? Yeah, great. Well, thanks, Shreya, for the introduction and for this opportunity. This is work we've been working on for a very long time, and it's really wonderful to be with all of you here today presenting it. This is joint work with a range of collaborators, Kritarth Jha, who's been with us for a few years at Development Data Lab, my longtime collaborator, Paul Novosad, Anjali Adukia at the University of Chicago, and Brandon Tan, who started with us when he was a PhD student and is now at the IMF. And let me just take a step back and say that for those of you who aren't familiar with my work, that really what Paul and I have been trying to work on for the last 15 years with many different great collaborators is trying to understand what we call development in high resolution. And really what this work starts from is the idea that the factors that shape economic opportunity are highly local, that kids can only go to schools that are nearby, that most workers really only have access to jobs that are within a pretty short radius, particularly when transportation infrastructure isn't very good, that most businesses in places like India, but really around the world, are quite small, and often their customers and their suppliers are really very, very nearby. And so we need to study the process of economic development and economic opportunity at that level at which people actually live. And so we're going to do this with big data. We're going to do this at scale, but we're going to focus on very high resolution units and understand how those factors shape people's lives. And what allows us to do this work is that for the first time, there are actually data to study development in high resolution. So once upon a time, you had the census, which was only really put out at the district level in all kinds of summary tables. You had things like the NSS. And so even if you get the microdata, it only has a district identifier. And so the Indian government has traditionally made policy at sort of those levels, let's say the district level. But Indian districts, as I'm sure I don't have to tell this audience, are huge. They're the size of countries in many parts of the world. And it doesn't necessarily do me a lot of good as a resident of, say, Kotra block in Udaipur district, where I've done a bunch of work. If there are good schools in the city of Udaipur, that's an 8-hour drive away, or at least it was when I was working there. I think that time has come down some. And so really what matters is sort of what's going on in my very local area. So what we're doing is assembling lots of high resolution comprehensive data from a variety of different sources. And I'll tell you a lot about it in today's talk, but government data exhaust, satellite imagery, and so on, to study these issues in high resolution. And part of what we're trying to do is to put a lot of these data out in the public domain. Our philosophy is that data, like all knowledge, should only have to be created once, and then it should be available for absolutely everybody. And it's a supreme and sad irony that oftentimes Indian data is more available to researchers in rich Western institutions like Harvard, where I started working with all these data when I was doing my PhD, than it is to people in the country whose lives it is both drawn from and can be used to benefit. So with that said, let me dive right in. This paper is really asking the question of, does residential segregation constrain access to opportunity? And I'm afraid to say we're not going to answer that completely satisfyingly, but that's the question we're starting with. And we're going to do the best we can to shed a lot of light on patterns of segregation in India and the outcomes that it's associated with. So what we're going to do is move from the sort of village and town level focus that has been most of my work down to the neighborhood level. And so we're going to construct a national data set of 1.5 million neighborhoods across both rural and urban India. And we're going to describe patterns of residential segregation of India's two major marginalized groups, Muslims and scheduled castes. I should say here that we are very interested in scheduled tribes. We're going to be starting a paper on scheduled tribe segregation soon. But given that the focus of this paper was really trying to understand rural and mostly urban segregation in India, there are so few scheduled tribes, at least officially in the data, in urban India, that it didn't make sense to kind of treat them together with Muslims and SCs. As you'll see, some of these patterns are similar between Muslims and SCs. Some of these things are going to be different, but we felt that STs needed their own treatment. And so we'll be doing that soon. And then after describing these patterns of residential segregation and establishing some core facts about segregation in India, we're really going to move down to the neighborhood level and study public service provision and economic outcomes in these marginalized group neighborhoods. How do these neighborhoods look different from others? And they'll look different in a number of different ways. And I think in the background of all of this, and in a lot of my work, is this general question of what do we learn from looking at development, at outcomes in high resolution? And I think this paper is a particularly direct demonstration of what we can only learn when we zoom down to the local level and what we'll miss if we stay at a higher level of aggregation. So in some sense, a lot of this paper can be summarized by the following figures. We're going to show you these outcomes in different ways, but this is our attempt to really kind of sum it all up. Here we're looking at secondary schools per 100,000 people. And these are going to be coefficients from a regression on the share of the location that is scheduled caste. And so you can see here is that actually states that have more scheduled castes have more secondary schools per 100,000 people. Now that may be just because of where scheduled castes happen to be located in the country. It may also be because there have been various policies by the Indian government to try to direct more educational resources towards areas with more SCs. When we then look across districts within states, we see that districts with more SCs also have more secondary schools. Districts with 10% more SCs have 0.06 more secondary schools per 100,000 people. When we then look across towns within districts, we see that even towns within districts, and the average district has about 10 urban places according to the census, they have more secondary schools as well than the same towns or sort of other towns in the same district that have fewer SCs. But then when you zoom into the neighborhood level, the level at which I was arguing a lot of life is lived, the level at which students access things like education, you see that a lot of this positive targeting is undone. And that places still with more SCs, neighborhoods with more SCs still end up having more secondary schools, but far fewer than they would if there weren't this massive negative selection where secondary schools are targeted to the neighborhoods that have far fewer SCs than the neighborhoods that have more. What does it look like for Muslims? Well, we see that there's not much of a difference across states that have more or fewer Muslims. We see that there's not too much of a difference across districts within states that have more or fewer Muslims. Likewise, across towns, not much going on. When you zoom into the neighborhood level, you see that within towns, the neighborhoods that have more Muslims are far less likely to receive a government secondary school than neighborhoods that have more Muslims. And it's these disparities that we're really going to be documenting and trying to understand a bit of in this paper. I should preface all of this by saying that, we're neither in a good position to understand all the causes of this, nor the consequences. We're going to try to establish a lot of facts that we hope kind of really gives the literature and the people working on these issues a big push and a lot of tools to make further progress. Hopefully we can make some of that progress in the future. Hopefully many other people can as well. Okay, so to give a preview of results so that you know where I'm going, there is very high segregation of both Muslims and SCs in both rural and urban India. Marginalized group share, so Muslim share or SC share, strongly predicts poor access to public services. This is what I was just saying, is that neighborhoods that have more Muslims and more SCs compared to nearby neighborhoods in those same towns or in those same subdistricts get far fewer of these public resources. And we see this with schools, we see this with health centers, and we see this with a number of other things that we can measure as well. Almost all of this disadvantage is across neighborhood within towns. As I showed you, actually, in some ways, at higher levels of aggregation, there's more positive targeting towards SC areas, but then when you get down to the neighborhood level, SCs living in these towns are much less likely to get access to these services than other people in these same cities. We then try to go further and look at economic outcomes, not just disparities in the provision of these public facilities, but actually what's happening to people living in these neighborhoods. And the closest thing that we can come to a sort of causal claim is that children in these marginalized group neighborhoods who otherwise look similar are growing up in similar circumstances to children elsewhere in households where the parents have similar levels of education, where they have similar levels of assets, have far worse educational outcomes. And then we really find that across a lot of these dimensions, Muslim neighborhoods have worse access to services and outcomes, even than SC neighborhoods, which have much worse access to services and outcomes than other neighborhoods. Okay, I'm going to move quickly through context since this is an Indian audience and most of you, I'm sure, know these issues better than I do. Scheduled castes and Muslims together make up over 30% of the Indian population. According to the 2011 census, scheduled castes are 17% and have faced centuries, if not millennia, of occupational, residential, and social segregation. But of course, the Indian government has various protective arrangements and affirmative action, at least in the modern era. Muslims are slightly smaller population, 14% as of 2011. India has the second largest Muslim population after Indonesia. And there's a lot of work that's been emerging that's showing that Muslims are really falling behind in many ways compared to other groups, even compared to SCs in some measures, like our work in intergenerational mobility shows. And more recently have faced waves of discrimination, violence, and so on. In general, getting to the issue of residential segregation, there's quite widespread opposition in India to having neighbors from other groups. And this is true across all sorts of different groups. So among Hindus, 36% say that they would not be willing to accept a Muslim as a neighbor. Among Muslims, 16% say that they wouldn't be willing to accept a Hindu as a neighbor. And these numbers, while they differ from group to group, tend to hold across a lot of India's major groups. Likewise, intermarriage is highly unpopular. 67% of Hindus and fully 80% of Muslims say that it's important to stop women in their community from marrying outside their religion. Actually, interestingly, these numbers are quite similar for men as well. As I said, our work on intergenerational mobility, an earlier paper that was looking at the opportunities of kids born into poorer families to get more education, finds that while it's always been better to be upper caste or OBC, scheduled castes have closed some of the economic opportunity gap with these groups. Scheduled tribes have closed less of the gap, but Muslims are actually in recent decades falling further and further behind. And we argued in that paper that affirmative action, which is targeted to SCs and STs, but not to Muslims, seems to be an important part of that story. I should say here that the potential effects of segregation, of living in neighborhoods that have a high proportion of your own group, the effects are theoretically ambiguous. There are potentially many harms from being segregated. that there are peer effects that you're not benefiting from in other communities, that you have worse access to job networks, that it facilitates state discrimination and disparities in the provision of public services, or that it contributes to stereotype formation from a lack of mixing with other people. That in general, there's a lot of evidence for this contact hypothesis that we tend to have more compassion for people that we've actually been in contact with. On the other hand, there are potential benefits from segregation. It might help you provide safety from violence. There's some sort of protection in numbers. People might have preferences to live with their own social group. This is referred to as homophily. And that might be because we have similar dietary restrictions. It might be because we like to attend the same religious or other kinds of institutions. It might be because we tend to work together and there's some sort of human capital which is highly correlated within the community. And so we can protect our own group industries in that way. So there are a lot of different reasons why people actually might choose to live in segregated areas. It's not just something forced upon people, though we think that there's probably some of that too. There's a much larger literature on segregation in the US, both on its causes and its consequences. There have been discriminatory laws in the US, making it difficult for African Americans to live in certain parts of the country or in certain neighborhoods within cities. There's evidence of what in the US we call white flight, of the more dominant group leaving areas once sufficient numbers of African Americans or other minorities move in. And there's a small but growing literature that's really trying to tackle the causal effects of segregation. It's a very hard thing to study because generally we don't have what's called exogenous variation in segregation. It's a kind of outcome that emerges correlated with a lot of other things. And so it's hard to say when we see more segregated areas have different outcomes, whether that's the result of segregation or whether it's the segregation as the result of some of those same factors. We have much less evidence in lower income countries, and I'll just kind of skip past this, but say we have very little evidence on segregation in lower income countries, I think to a large extent because the data haven't been available. And that's why in this paper, a lot of the work that we had to put in was at the first stage in figuring out how do we actually go about measuring both segregation and outcomes in segregated neighborhoods. We do know quite a bit qualitatively and a little bit quantitatively about segregation in India. So there's a large qualitative literature on Muslim ghettos. Geyer and Jaffarlo is just one example. The Sucher committee had this seminal report on very poor access to public services for Muslims, among other things. And there has been some evidence found, say, by Banerjee and Somanathan about some equalization in disparities. In their case, they were looking at more at SCs, in disparities over time, that maybe some of the disparities in public goods provision, especially in things like primary schools, are getting less severe over time as almost all of India's villages, for example, now have primary schools. Now, Bharati et al. Have done some incredible work more recently on doing quantitative work on segregation. I'll say that we kind of take a bunch of their findings as a jumping off point. And we really try to take a step forward by really examining this association, not just by describing segregation, but this association between neighborhood characteristics and government service provision and economic opportunities and outcomes, which has been difficult with, say, a lot of their data because they don't have these public facilities or outcomes. Okay, so how are we going to do this? I won't bore you with all the details of the data, but basically we spent many years putting together enumeration block data on both who lives there and what these neighborhoods actually look like. So an enumeration block is the smallest unit that the census collects data in. It's supposed to be a walkable space of about 100 to 125 households. And what we realized is that both the socioeconomic and caste census of 2012, which we had been scraping for a long time when the PDFs were posted online, and the economic census of 2013, they both used the same enumeration block identifiers. And so they were both based on the population census of 2011. And so what we were able to do is put them together to be able to describe both who lives in a given neighborhood and the public facilities of that neighborhood. And so the SECC is this poverty census. It's the most recent of many different rounds of poverty censuses that the Indian government has done, and it collects detailed information on assets, demographics, education, and so on. There's actually a variable for SC, but we had to classify Muslims by their names. The names are in the data. We don't use directly identifiable data. We mask all of it before we use it, but we do use the names in order to classify whether people are Muslim or not, using a neural net. And we have like 97% accuracy out of sample in this classifier. So we're very confident that the people we classify as Muslim are in fact Muslim. We can also use the SECC to see some, not just private assets, like do you own a refrigerator or a two-wheeler, but also can be used to infer location amenities, things like piped water. You can only have piped water in your house if in fact the government in some way is providing a piped water network there. In the economic census, while it's mostly used to study the private sector, it's a complete enumeration of all non-farm economic establishments, both government and private, and it records their sector. And so in this case, we can see where the government places both schools and health facilities. And so that's what we're going to focus on here, is these disparities in both health and educational facilities. Let me just give a quick plug and say that the data backbone we use here and for a lot of our other work is the Shrug. This is what Shreya mentioned, or is at least our flagship open data platform. And basically, we've been putting together for the last 15 years, high resolution data from a wide range of different public and other data sets. And so it covers all 600,000 villages, 8,000 towns, 4,000 assembly constituencies in India from 1990 to the present, all with a standard geographic unit, the Shrug identifier or SHRID. And it's all open access. We've posted as much data as we can. We provide keys to allow you to work with data sets if you get your hands on the microdata. And we just put out Shrug 2.0, which we hope is much more useful than Shrug 1.0. It has GIS data, it has parliamentary constituencies, it has a lot more different data sets than we originally had. We hope it's useful. Please do check it out. It's been really cool to see how much work people are doing with it, and we're always looking to make it better. So don't hesitate to reach out if you have suggestions or anything to contribute. We're really encouraging people to contribute data sets to it. Okay, as I said, we're going to measure access to public services by seeing in the economic census where government facilities are. And so in the case of schools, we have two industrial classifications. We have primary schools, which are 851, and secondary schools, which are NIC 852. And we're going to be able to see the differences in where primary schools are located and where secondary schools are located. For health facilities, it's a little more unclear, the lines between these inpatient, outpatient, and other facilities. So we're just going to combine them all into a single measure of health facilities. And in measuring these things, we'll look both at a binary for, is there a public facility here? We'll also look at kind of the intensive margin, how big are these facilities, by looking at the log of employment in these facilities in a given area. To measure segregation, there are many, many different ways of measuring segregation, and they're all basically inequality measures that say how unequally are members of a given group distributed across lower units within some bigger unit. So if you think about segregation within a city, it's saying how unevenly are, say, SCs distributed across these enumeration blocks, across these neighborhoods within the city. So if SCs are 20% of the city's population, you can have them all concentrated into certain neighborhoods where they're 100% of the population, and then lots of neighborhoods where they're 0% of the population, or they could be totally evenly distributed with no segregation, where every neighborhood is 20% SC and everything in between. So this is going to be how we measure segregation with a dissimilarity index, which is basically saying what share of the SC population would need to be moved across neighborhoods in order to equalize their distribution absolutely everywhere within this larger unit, within this city or sub-district. We've done this analysis with many other alternate measures like the Gini coefficient, entropy measure, isolation, and so on. And generally, they're very highly correlated. Let me skip the summary statistics, which is say these neighborhoods end up being in our data on average about 500 people. And what we see is that, just replicating work that many other people have done, Muslims are a bit more likely to be found in urban areas. Scheduled castes are a bit more likely to be found in rural areas. On average, urban neighborhood has a 7% chance of having a public primary school and a 2% chance of having a public secondary school, whereas rural areas, a given neighborhood, has a 33% chance of having a public primary school and a 7% chance of having a public secondary school. And this is because, of course, in rural areas, the distances are greater, and so you need to place more schools in order to actually give the population access. In urban areas, you can go across neighborhoods a bit. Okay, so what do we find? First, on just segregation, what we find is that there are very high levels of segregation in India. These numbers, these distributions are actually kind of close to the distribution of segregation in US cities among Blacks, which is to say very, very high. The US is a very segregated society. US Blacks tend to live in different neighborhoods. SCs and Muslims don't look so dissimilar from the spatial distribution patterns of US Blacks. We do find that SCs, by dissimilarity measures, are a bit more segregated than Muslim. They're much more segregated than Muslims in rural areas. They're a little bit more segregated than Muslims in urban areas. Depending on the measure, you can get a slight switch here in the urban areas, where by some measures, Muslims look a little bit more segregated, basically because they're more likely to be found at the tails of the distribution. So if you look on the figure to the left, what we see is that while SCs are more segregated overall, that's sort of the blue dots in the middle of this distribution show that there are many more neighborhoods that have 40, 50% SCs than there are Muslims. There are more neighborhoods that are 80% Muslim than there are that are 80% SC. So Muslims are more likely to be found in neighborhoods that are extremely high in their Muslim share. But there are more SCs found in neighborhoods that are kind of in the middle ranges. And that leads to there being more segregated overall by this dissimilarity measure. We do a lot of spatial work. We look at a lot of maps of India. A lot of maps of India have strong patterns. Education levels are higher in the south than the north. A lot of women's empowerment measures look a lot better in the south and the east than they do in the north and the west. One of the things that's striking about these measures of segregation and when we map them is that actually the patterns aren't that strong. In SC dissimilarity, you see slightly darker reds in say Bihar than you do in Madhya Pradesh, but actually there are pretty high levels of segregation around the country, and likewise for Muslims. We do find that younger cities are a little bit less segregated than older cities. We see this that basically, we have a dissimilarity measure for cities that were founded in the 1870s and 80s of around 0.65. That's come down to around 0.58. So the younger cities are a little bit less segregated than the older cities, but we're not, this is basically, the slope on this is so close to flat that we're not sure we can conclude all that much about how segregation is changing over time in India. Unfortunately, we don't have these kind of neighborhood measures from historical censuses that would allow us to actually see segregation in those previous years. We do find that cities are reproducing local rural settlement patterns, that the urban areas in districts with high levels of rural segregation have high levels of segregation. The cities in districts that have low levels of rural segregation have much lower levels of urban segregation. And this is true both for SCs and for Muslims. Okay, let's zoom into the neighborhood level now and say, how do neighborhoods with large shares of these marginalized groups look different from other neighborhoods? And the way we're going to do that is we're going to run a regression that regresses, say, the presence of a service or how many people work in this service in public schools or in public health facilities in a given neighborhood on the share of the population in that neighborhood that is from these marginalized communities. And we're going to have different fixed effects that are going to tell us about the different geographic levels at which these disparities are appearing. So I'm sorry I'm moving quickly, but we don't have that much time, and I want to leave a lot of time for discussion and questions. I'm sure that's going to be very interesting. So it's just to say we're going to have different fixed effects, and we're going to learn something about whether, as I showed you in those first figures, these disparities are opening up across states, across districts within states, across sub-districts or towns within districts, and then across neighborhoods within those sub-districts or towns. There are, of course, limitations to this approach. To be very clear, I'm using the word disparities here, not discrimination. We don't know whether it's discrimination exactly. I think a lot more work is needed on this because, of course, the provision of public facilities is this complicated negotiation between all sorts of different actors, and we're just seeing the outcomes. We're just seeing how likely is there to be a government facility in these neighborhoods. We only see a limited set of public facilities. We've broadened that out a bit in this paper, but still, we'd like to be able to see many more things. It's always possible that particular neighborhoods have more of one facility and less of another, even though in general, these things tend to be highly correlated. And of course, especially in urban areas, people can access facilities in other neighborhoods, though at some cost. Okay, so what do we see? Within cities, we see that the more Muslims there are in a neighborhood, the less likely it is that the Indian government has built a secondary school in that neighborhood. Things are a little more complicated for SCs. We see that at very low levels of SC shares, there might be a slight increase in the likelihood of having a secondary school, but once you get into high levels of SC shares in urban neighborhoods, they're much less likely than other neighborhoods in that city to have a secondary school from the government. This is just a table showing you that, and it's showing you that this shows up whether there's an indicator for the presence of that facility or we're doing this in employment, which is basically just to say that this is not just the fact that there are fewer schools in Muslim neighborhoods, say, but they're bigger schools that are there for more people. They're both smaller and fewer in number. I already showed you this figure. This is decomposing this disadvantage by different administrative levels. I already showed you this figure too, but now hopefully this makes a little bit more sense now that I've spent a little bit more time explaining it. So basically, to summarize our public facilities findings, we find that by every measure that we take, we actually primary schools, secondary schools, and a bunch of other things, we see that these public facilities are really kind of allocated away. There are large disparities in the provision of these facilities. They're less found in these SC and Muslim neighborhoods. It's more extreme for Muslims. Just to put something in perspective, going from a neighborhood with no Muslims to 100% Muslims is associated with 46% fewer secondary schools. So a neighborhood is half as likely to have a government secondary school if it's entirely Muslim compared to a neighborhood nearby in the same city that has no Muslims. And of course, as we showed, the view from aggregate data is very different. Across districts, more Muslim districts don't have appreciably fewer secondary schools, and actually SC districts have appreciably more secondary schools than other districts. Okay, but what about outcomes? Is this actually where that's where the rubber meets the road, right? It matters where the public facilities are, but maybe the kids can access public facilities elsewhere. Maybe people are finding other ways of getting educated, say by the private sector, and likewise for health. So can we say anything about how segregation is associated with actual economic outcomes? And in this case, the closest we come to being able to make causal claims about what living in a highly segregated neighborhood is doing for your life chances is to look at schooling outcomes for young people. When you're growing up, you're born by an accident of fate into a particular household, into a particular neighborhood. I was fortunate to be born to two educated parents in the United States. My family had fled Europe 100 years ago when violence against Jews was breaking out. And they fled to the United States, actually to very segregated neighborhoods, at least in the short run. I didn't grow up in very segregated neighborhoods 100 years after my great-grandparents came over. Other people are born in other circumstances. And what we want to know is, how are those circumstances shaping your life outcomes? And what we want to do in this exercise is say, we want to compare kids who look like they're growing up in very similar circumstances in the household, who are growing up in houses that have similar levels of assets, in houses where the parents have similar levels of education, but some of them are in these highly segregated neighborhoods, some of them are in these less segregated neighborhoods, and see whether just that higher level of segregation, controlling for everything that we can observe about the household itself, is associated with different economic outcomes, in this case, educational outcomes for the kids. And so we're going to run a very similar regression, but we're going to control for household characteristics here, and we're going to use this microdata And the household characteristics we'll control for are parental education, both mother and father, as well as consumption, which is basically putting together all of the different assets that we can see in the SECC. And we can even control for the average neighborhood income and say, okay, in an equally poor or rich neighborhood that has a higher degree of these marginalized groups, and therefore we know has lower provision of these public facilities, do we see the kids getting less education? And unfortunately, the answer is yes. So if you look in the middle rows at SC share and Muslim share, let me just highlight some things here. So here, what you can see is that kids in an entirely SC neighborhood are getting 0.14 fewer years of education compared to equivalent kids in neighborhoods that have no SCs. And this is controlling, as you can see, for father education, for mother education, for all sorts of assets that we're doing here with consumption, and even for whether you belong to this group or not. So this is really suggesting that here on the SC share and here on the Muslim share, that there are just very large likely effects of living in these neighborhoods, even among kids who look totally the same otherwise. And really, you can see on the first three columns are for sons, the next three columns are for daughters. We can see very, very similar outcomes, very similar neighborhood penalties for daughters, even after controlling for all of these household characteristics. Okay, so let me wrap up. I think I've gone on long enough, and I really want to hear people's questions. Urban India seems to be replicating the very high degrees of segregation among SCs and Muslims that we've seen in rural India for a very long time. The overwhelming sight of the disadvantages that we document in access to public facilities among SCs and Muslims is coming at the neighborhood level within towns. That's really the action where there seem to be sort of large disparities in the provision of these facilities. And I should comment that, that's the level at which the higher levels of the state have a lot of trouble observing what's going on, right? There's all this data on states, there's all this data on districts and how many schools districts have and all that. There's very little data, there's very little information that, say, higher levels of the bureaucracy can actually tap into to see whether there are disparities at the local neighborhood level. And I think we need to understand much more, and political scientists are, like Adam Auerbach, like Tarek Tachil and others are doing an excellent job of really kind of illuminating some of the negotiation and conflict that goes into the provision of public facilities, of access to these public services at the local level within cities. We hope that the findings here can help to contribute to those understandings. And certainly to elevate these issues, we hope, because you can see how important this is for people's outcomes. We find that city settlement patterns seem to be highly persistent. We showed you that those older cities and newer cities seem to both have very, very high levels of segregation. But that, like, when you build cities and when people settle them, they tend to stay at those areas. Neighborhoods that were Muslim 100 years ago are much more likely to be Muslim today. And so as India urbanizes right now, as new cities are being built, as rural areas are becoming urban and so on, we want to be really thoughtful about how this process of urbanization is happening, because it's likely that the disparities that are laid down today end up affecting people's lives for decades, for generations. And so we're going to put out all this data into the public domain. We're going to post it very soon. We're just in the sort of final process of working on this paper and getting feedback. And so we really hope that these findings and the data that we put out, people find very useful, that they can really take it and run with it and learn much more than just the kind of surface scratching that I've told you about today. So on that, let me stop. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Sam. Thanks for, not only joining us for this talk, but, thank you for sort of doing this work, putting it out, and, all of the work that you've been doing with public data and making public data accessible over the last 15, 20 years. So I will open with a few set of questions, from me, and then we'll open it up to the floor. I think we already have a couple of questions, but please feel free to, as we are speaking, please feel free to place your questions in the Q&A box. So Sam, I think I wanted to start by saying, I think this work, I mean, it's incredibly important work, right? And I think in a way, it's something that, all observers of India and of Indian urbanization will intuitively know to be true. But it's one of those things where nobody knows how much and where and, how different groups are affected differently, right? So in a way, it sort of confirms a lot of intuitive observations, but actually puts sort of allows us to quantify it. So what I wanted to ask you was a couple of questions in terms of, thinking forward, right, after this work or after, we know what this work tells us. So my question is of two parts. One is, what are the implications for research, for understanding sort of allocation of public goods at the local level? And then the second is really on the implications of policy, right? So coming back to the first question, which is to say that, while on aggregate across the country, we sort of all can agree that marginalized neighborhoods do have sort of lower levels of access. We also know that there is a lot of variation that, that masks, right? That within across neighborhoods, that there are certain marginalized neighborhoods, and you yourself refer to the work of political scientists that gives us some of that fine grain of understanding how some neighborhoods are able to more successfully negotiate or leverage, and get access to public services, whereas others aren't, right? So one of my questions is on what do you think is the sort of agenda for future research on, what are the really next level of research questions to be taken up now that we have this work? And the second one was on policy, which is really on saying, what, this work really tells us on how the government should be intervening, whether we take place-based approaches, whether we take income-based approaches, whether we take social identity-based approaches. And of course, I mean, it is a mix of all of those, but, what your sense is after having looked at this data really closely and looked at all of this work for these two things. So it's just a high-level question I thought to open up with, and then we can get to the specifics.
Yeah, thanks. Totally agree with everything you've said. And these are the hard questions that come next. So everything I say here is going to be a bit speculative, but let me do my best to point in some directions that I think would be really important for both research and policy. I think for me, the research questions are sort of threefold. One is about what are the drivers of segregation, and really why is it that India and so many other places have such high degrees of segregation of people living in different places? And the reason for that is that those will help to answer what we can actually do about this segregation. And so the extent to which things like violence lead to higher levels of segregation, and there are people who are trying to do some work on this, and we might in the future. The extent to which the law actually facilitates it. In the United States, the law absolutely drove a bunch of segregation. I mentioned redlining earlier. Blacks could not get loans from banks to build houses in certain neighborhoods. And in India, actually, the courts have said that like housing societies can practice segregation, and that has to contribute to it. There's certainly a lot of segregation that people would like to practice in places like the United States that they can't because there are laws that say that they can't, right? And so when the state comes in and says that you can, that I think cannot be helping. So there's a lot more to be done. And as you can see here, we don't have a whole lot to say about what the causes are of this segregation. We try to establish some really big, broad facts that we hope kind of help people to investigate things in the future. The research challenge, of course, is that like, how do you get something like random variation in any of these causes? These causes are complicated. They're all interrelated. Violence doesn't come out of nowhere. So even when you want, even when you have data on violence, and people like Ashutosh Varshney and others have put together a lot of detailed data on violence, how do you actually conclude that when violence is associated with segregation, it's the direction of causality is flowing from violence to segregation and not vice versa, or from other factors entirely? So I think one whole set of questions is around these causes. In some ways, I'm more interested in research on the consequences and what sort of the circumstances are that would make the consequences less bad for people. Again, coming back to the example of my own family, my father went to a high school in Brooklyn that was, I believe, over 95% Jewish. So highly segregated, but a people got a lot of education. They were growing up poor, they were growing up segregated, but people actually managed to get a lot of education, and everybody moved out. They moved out of these neighborhoods, and these neighborhoods have turned over and become Dominican and Puerto Rican. And after that, large immigrant communities from South Asia and other places came into these areas. So to some extent, we want to understand the circumstances in which people are actually able to, over the course of generations, escape a lot of these constraints. And I fear that in India, that there are very low levels of mobility. There are very high levels of persistence in poverty and in locations. It's going to make it very difficult to kind of escape these cycles. And so I would be really interested in knowing a lot more, and maybe this is going to come from working with governments, maybe this is going to come from secondary data. I don't know where the answers are going to come from, but under what circumstances can we sort of either break the cycle of segregation or break its association with such negative life outcomes? And so I think that's where research and policy are kind of asking the same questions. I think that, you know, on the one hand, policy can come in and say, hey, you're not allowed to practice segregation, but it's very likely that people are going to find ways for a very long time to practice segregation. It's also likely, as we said, that there may be some reasons why marginalized communities themselves are self-segregating in order to protect themselves in some ways, or in order to, you know, have shared access to these, to things like mosques or to other sorts of facilities and institutions. And that's fine. We want people to be able to make those decisions freely. The question is, again, how do you make sure that those decisions, for whatever good or bad reasons that they're being made, are actually not leading to persistent cycles of poverty and marginalization? And so I think that India's various affirmative action policies are probably an important step there. I would consider extending them to more groups. And I know that there are, of course, constant debates about economically weaker sections, and whether more groups should have kind of more protections and affirmative action. I guess the other big area where I would want to push on both policy and to some extent research, and actually, if there are any policymakers in the room who would be interested in doing this, I'm very keen on this. You know, the methodological point, or the sort of meta point we're making here in this paper, is that you miss a lot when you don't have the right data. When you don't have high resolution data and you can't see what's going on at the local level, you're not going to be able to address the inequalities that are appearing at those levels. And so I think that building stronger statistical systems, building stronger data pipelines that really put into the hands of people in policy and civil society who holds government accountable, and the media and private firms and everyone else, much higher resolution data would allow for much better decision making and allow for much more accountability. Because right now, I think that the local bargaining that political scientists and others are doing a good job of starting to illuminate goes largely unobserved at higher levels. And I think that, you know, I don't, they say that sunlight is the best disinfectant. I guess I would say sunlight is a better disinfectant than nothing. It's probably not going to be anywhere close to sufficient, but certainly I'd rather have sunlight than darkness. And I think right now, operating with far too much darkness. So I'd love to see both steps in the direction of stronger data systems to put these kind of information into the hands of empowered policymakers, and then research on that and how that actually changes the decision-making process.
Thank you, Sam. And I can see a lot of questions in the Q&A box. So I'll just take one last one and then I'll open it out. Since you sort of, you know, stopped on the point of data and methods, I wanted to just sort of ask you to reflect on, you know, what the quality of the data sets has been. So I think, you know, again, it's like I said, you know, some of the findings that you've presented to us today, I think everybody in this room would probably be in agreement with. But I'm curious, I mean, given that you have worked closely with SECC data for a while now, I mean, we've been working with the economic census data, and we understand the sort of interstate variation in data quality in the economic census, right? The 2013 round, but not as familiar with the SECC data. So, what, you know, in both sort of at the aggregate level, at the sort of data quality of data sets point, but, you know, also for particular variables where you felt like, you know, where you did certain analysis and you dropped certain variables because you felt like the data quality was not, it would be great for this audience to hear your sort of insight on, you know, on that, like really just getting into the details as well.
Sure. You know, we spent a lot of time validating the SECC against NSS and IIHS and other data sets that were collected around that time. And broadly, and not just the data itself, but then what we did with the data. Like we created this small area estimation consumption measure, which is basically finding a way of collapsing all of the assets and other economic variables in the SECC to a single measure of how well off is this household. And we did it with predicted consumption. And the way we did that, since this was a geeky data methods question, I'm going to answer it in a geeky data methods way. Assuming that somebody in the audience, or at the very least, just me and Shreya are interested in this stuff. We basically in the IIHS regress consumption on all of the different variables that we also have in the SECC, and then we use the coefficients from that regression to weight the different assets in the SECC and aggregate them up to a consumption measure. So knowing that a household has a four-wheeler suggests that they're much better off than if they have a two-wheeler, or if they have a cell phone, or if they have, and then there are categories of the income level of the highest earning member of the household and so on. And we smush all of these together into a consumption measure that we can actually go and use, because if you just have all these disparate assets, it's not necessarily that useful. So we validated both our consumption measure and all the individual assets against a lot of these other data sets and found that the correspondence is really tight. Is it perfect? No. You always have these issues. What we kind of have decided for things like the economic census, where we have many rounds, but not enough. There hasn't been one that's come out and been made available since 2013. Though we're all optimistic that this latest round is going to come out sometime soon. The economic census, I also spent a lot of time kicking the tires on, and I ended up concluding that it is a very strong signal of economic activity at the local level. It's not the very best employment measure, or rather it is an employment measure, and the different rounds of the economic census measure employment in different ways, but it's not the same employment measure as the NSS or as the Periodic Labor Force Survey. And so in general, what we do is we use these data sets to try to understand these patterns at the local level, or impacts of policies at the local level, rather than trying to describe big trends in the country, because there may be errors or there may be differences with kind of across rounds or with other data sets that are going to make it very difficult to say with confidence, the economic census tells us that employment is up by this amount or is down by that amount or whatever else. But what it does allow you to do is say, when you build roads into a village, does employment go up? We think that whatever errors there are and whatever differences in measurement there are not going to be correlated with the exogenously determined presence of roads in our road studies, right? And so I would encourage people who are using these data sets to kind of use them less for those big aggregate trends and much more for understanding patterns at the local level, which is exactly their strength.
Great, thanks, Sam. I think we should head over to the Q&A box. Yeah.
Okay. I'm just going to quickly go, lots of great questions. Let me quickly go through the ones that I can tick off quickly. How much time do we want to take? I can take a few extra minutes if you want. We got started a little late.
Yes, we could. We could take up to 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes. Perfect.
Yes.
Okay. That works for everyone. There's a question about, are the data missing in Kerala? Keen observer noticed that we're missing in the maps data for Kerala. Yeah. In the SECC, we weren't able to quality data for Kerala. We basically were scraping all these PDFs when the Indian government put them up back in 2013, 14, and into 15 and 16 even. They didn't post everything. Our crawlers probably missed some things. And then there were a lot of badly formatted PDFs that we weren't able to extract data. So we got data for about 80% of the country, but unfortunately missed a bunch in Kerala. Rizwan was asking about why are towns the final unit for defining neighborhood and not villages. Apologies. I usually give this talk in like an hour and a half, and we have much more time to go into many more of these methodological issues. So the neighborhood is going to be the enumeration block. It's going to be that lowest level of 100, 125 households, about 500 people on average in our data. The higher level for looking at segregation or for looking at disparities across neighborhoods within this higher unit is for urban areas, towns, and is for rural areas, sub-districts. Actually, on average, they're kind of similar in size on average. Because when you're studying segregation, when you're studying these disparities, you always have to say how unequal either is the distribution of public services or the distribution of marginalized group populations across neighborhoods within some higher unit. And so the higher unit is the town for urban areas, is the sub-district for rural areas. Why are there are differences in the allocation of these public facilities across higher units like states and districts and lower units like neighborhoods? I think I've kind of touched on this a bit, but let me try to put a finer point on it and say that I think a lot of this comes down to the fact that policy is made at higher levels. India has backwards districts programs where schools are built in districts that have more SCs or that have lower levels of female literacy, or there are tax breaks that are given to firms if they locate in areas that have less industrial activity or those kind of things. There's a lot of stuff that's been done at the district level where they collect district data and they do district targeting, and a lot of stuff around trying to increase access to educational facilities for SCs. There's nothing like that at the neighborhood level. There's always been this presumption that we don't have neighborhood level data. We can't get into it. It'll be some local bargain between bureaucrats and local politics and local people and so on. And what we're arguing here is that we're in the 21st century. These data exist, and we spend a lot of our time investing and tying them together. I know there are efforts, we've been a part of efforts within government, like at Niti Aayog with NDAP, to try to tie data together at the higher levels of spatial resolution. But I think there's just so much more to be done. And I would argue that this is like a final mile challenge. Just like there's a final mile challenge of like, how do you reach, how do you get electricity into every household and not just into every village or into every sub-district? There's a final mile challenge on data too, which is you've produced it and the Indian government largely has produced the necessary data. How the heck do we tie it together? And it's a pain, but it's not nearly as hard as collecting the data in the first place. And so I think there's just a lot of low-hanging fruit from investing much more in these data systems. A question about STs, like we're working on it. As I said at the very beginning, we decided that STs, the issues were sufficiently different that they deserve their own paper. And so we're going to do that. And we're going to put out all these data so that other people can work on ST segregation as well. Question about self-segregation. I think that the different causes of segregation are an area where a lot of research is needed. And we don't, unfortunately, have a lot to say here about it because we don't have that random variation in or anything close to it in any of these causes. I do think that research on violence in India is going to shed a bunch of light when combined with these segregation data on the extent to which violence is leading groups to actually self-segregate in order to protect themselves. But we're going to have to wait on the work of Arushi Kalra and other groups for this, and maybe us at some point as well. The data management for this study, I would just encourage people to, it's a great question. We just don't really have the time here. I would just encourage people to read our papers. We generally talk a lot about how the data are constructed, particularly my earlier papers, the Shrug paper in the World Bank Economic Review, our Rural Roads paper in the American Economic Review talk a lot about how we put this stuff together, and there's a lot of documentation at devdatalab.org. Can these data be overlaid with employment patterns, considering employment as kind of an essential service? So I think of employment as like a downstream outcome, like kids' education, right? That like there are public facilities placed, there are public services provided, people move into certain neighborhoods, all of that stuff is kind of happening at once. And then conditional on all that infrastructure and where people are, they try to find jobs. To some extent, they're following the jobs, but to some extent, they're able to access jobs or not from these areas. And so I think there is a lot more work to be done on the relationship between segregation and employment. It was beyond the scope of this paper, but again, when we put out the data, we hope that people can kind of really dig into some of these questions. What would unsegregating look like? Well, I guess we can learn a little bit from the process in the United States. Unsegregating is taking a very, very long time. It's now no longer legal to practice housing discrimination. But of course, for all the reasons that I mentioned early in the talk, segregation is going to persist, in part because residential patterns are persistent, in part because the reasons that places were segregated before are still there. Are people still racist in the United States? Yes. Do people still want to live among their own groups? Yes. Are members of marginalized communities still trying to protect themselves from violence, even though those levels of violence have come down? Absolutely. And so, it's taking a very, very long time, and it's a very complicated and messy process. And I think that, what we can do to a large extent is remove bad policies that actually allow people to practice active discrimination. And we can invest a lot in empowering members of marginalized groups to get more education, to get better jobs, to make freer housing decisions, to get access to capital, which would allow them to build their own houses in places that they want, and so on. Measuring educational outcomes. We measure it in years of education based in the SCCC. The economic census doesn't have anything on the education of workers. So all of that is coming from the socioeconomic and caste census. Question about the enumeration block as a neighborhood unit, and whether aggregating differently would produce different outcomes. This is a great question from Zara Mahdi. And what we find here is that yes, and many other researchers do, and actually I would point you to the work of Bharati et al., who do a lot of really nice work on how kind of looking at different levels may matter for measuring segregation. The enumeration block is the most granular level that we can look at, and so that's what we wanted to do. We also don't know where all of these enumeration blocks are within villages or within towns. And so there was only so much we could do in aggregating up, but we do aggregate up some like adjacent enumeration blocks. And we do find that segregation is highly persistent even when you aggregate, but it's less than at the local level. So in some sense, if you think about this, like start at the household level, and because of endogamy, because of people marrying within their own groups, almost every household is totally segregated. Almost every household is totally Muslim, or is totally SC, or is totally other. Like that's because people tend to marry within their groups. But then when you go up a little bit, go up to like neighboring houses, people are very likely to live next to neighbors of similar groups, but not nearly as likely as they are to be married to people in similar groups. And the higher and higher and higher up you go until you get to all of India, you kind of mechanically, to some extent, get less segregation in that regard. I think there's good work to be done on how this changes at different levels and how that relates to different units of government administration and public service facility, but we can't say too much on that right now. So this next question is describing work in Bangalore on like the rich geography and how different classes live in different areas. We would love to have better information on exactly where all these enumeration blocks are, and we're working on geotagging the enumeration blocks in Delhi and Mumbai in order to be able to say more about where different types of people live. But I love this work that's been done in Bangalore, and I hope people do much more of it in other cities. There's lots of interesting work on this around the world. There's some really rich work in Argentina, for example, that showed that basically the rich lived in the low-lying areas earlier on because those were the areas where you could get access to running water and it was easier to get places. And then when I forget whether it was cholera or other diseases started to become endemic, the rich basically pushed out the poor who were living higher up and built piped water. And so you can actually see these patterns changing over time as technologies and threats and so on change as well. Amaya asked about enumeration block in the SECC and the EC and other government surveys, and whether this is just a happy coincidence. This is just a happy coincidence. It just we just noticed that in both of these surveys, like neither of these surveys really were trying to put out data at the enumeration block level. We just noticed that they had these identifiers, and that allowed us to look at these patterns of segregation. But it's also why we don't know exactly where these places are, because there are maps out there, but the government of India charges so much for these like really terrible hand-drawn maps from the census that like it's not feasible even for us with our relatively large team to go and actually digitize very much of it.
Yeah, but just to add to that, yes, of course, the Census of India 2001 uses the census enumeration block as the smallest unit of collecting data, and the SCCC and EC were built on that base, which is why they released, using those. And I mean, other like sample surveys like the NSS are not done at sort of that spatial resolution, and so they do not use enumeration blocks, but other sort of census-like surveys like these two would be using census enumeration blocks. Hopefully
not
in the future as well. No,
yeah,
not
exactly.
putting them out, of course. And I'm hoping that, we will actually have these data sets being collected again in the future. So, yeah.
Hopefully, exactly. I recognize that we're out of time. So let me just do one last question. Let me just kind of skim through and see if there's anything else that I can say. Okay, so Rizwan is asking about, are these estimates of kids' education really causal? And the answer is fully, no. It's not random where people live. People live where they live for various reasons. I'm living in Islington here in London because, of the ability to commute to the areas that Radhika, my partner, and I need to get to. And, the location amenities and everything else. And we can afford to live here in a way that less well-off people can't. It's totally not random. And so the best that we can do in that part of the analysis is to control for everything that we can observe about both you and your parents and the sort of neighborhood socioeconomic status as a whole, to try to understand whether just there's an additional sort of effect or rather correlational association between having a large number of these marginalized groups and educational attainment after taking out all of that, controlling for all of those other factors. So I would say doesn't quite rise to the level of causal. It is highly, highly suggestive that these neighborhoods are consequential, because people who are just as well off as people elsewhere are getting less education when they're in these neighborhoods. Whether people realize that or not, I don't know. I think there's a lot more work to be done on this, but as with so much else in this paper, it's sort of suggestive evidence that we hope both policymakers and other researchers can, and our future selves can run with at some point. So let me stop on that and say thanks so much for this opportunity. This has been really terrific. These were great questions. We'll announce when we're assuming that Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it now is still around. We will be putting out these data and announcing that very soon. But again, thank you. I really, really enjoyed this.
Thank you so much, Sam, and thank you to our audience. It was a fantastic turnout, almost 100 people throughout the talk, and thank you for all of you and your fabulous questions. And once again, thank you, Sam, and to all of your collaborators as well for all of this fantastic work. And we look forward to the next round.
Likewise, maybe in person sometime soon.
Yes.